In a quiet, forgotten corner of the kingdom, there stands a humble tavern where travelers and locals alike come to drink, rest, and escape the chaos of the world beyond. But when a band of ruthless outlaws walks through the tavern doors, they unwittingly cross paths with someone far deadlier than they could ever imagine. A quiet, unassuming young woman working behind the bar is about to reveal a side of herself that even the most fearsome criminals should never provoke. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The scent of roasted meat and spiced cider filled the air in the small tavern, nestled on the edge of a forgotten road. The only sign of life for miles, the tavern was a refuge for weary travelers seeking solace from the dangers of the road. A simple place of shelter and warmth. Inside, the fire crackled and danced in the hearth, casting shadows on the stone walls, while the low murmur of conversation filled the room. It was the perfect picture of peace, until they came. The tavern door swung open with a heavy creak, and the cold wind that followed swept in like a herald of doom. A group of 6 men entered, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. They were draped in dark, worn leather armor, their faces rough and scarred from a life of violence. Their eyes, cold and predatory, scanned the room like wolves searching for prey. At their center, a tall man with a long, crooked nose and a patch over one eye sneered at the few patrons who dared to look up from their mugs. "Quiet, all of you," he growled, his voice rough like gravel. "We're not here to cause trouble. Not unless we're forced to." The other men chuckled lowly, each one of them brandishing a weapon. Knives, swords, and the occasional rusted axe, tools of their trade. They were outlaws, known throughout the region for raiding merchant caravans and terrorizing villages. Their name alone sent shivers down the spines of the local folk. At the far end of the bar, behind a counter piled with empty mugs and steaming pots of stew, stood a young woman, no older than 20. Her long, dark hair was tied back in a simple braid, and her plain brown dress did little to draw attention to her. Her hands, skilled from years of serving drinks and food, moved with practiced precision as she wiped down a wooden table, her back to the intruders. She was quiet, unnoticed by most. In a place like this, people didn't pay attention to the help. But the outlaws? They noticed everything. One of them, a brutish man with a scar running down his cheek, approached the counter. His boots echoed loudly in the stillness of the room as he leaned on the edge, leering at her. "What's your name, girl?" he demanded, his voice oozing with menace. The young woman didn't look up. She continued to wipe the table, as if she hadn't heard him. But the scarred man wasn't used to being ignored. He reached over the counter, his hand grabbing for her arm. "I'm talking to you, girl. Don't make me repeat myself." Her hand stopped moving, but her gaze remained fixed on the wood before her. A subtle tension filled the air, like the calm before a storm. The room, once filled with the laughter and chatter of patrons, seemed to hold its breath. The man's grip tightened, and the other outlaws began to shift, sensing the growing discomfort of the situation. One of them, a wiry fellow with a nasty grin, snickered. "What's the matter, girl? Afraid of us?" he taunted. The young woman slowly turned her head, her dark eyes narrowing just enough to send a silent message. She was no stranger to threats. She had learned early in life that silence was often the loudest response. Her voice, soft and controlled, broke the silence like a knife through the air. "Let go of me." For a moment, the scarred man stared at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. But then a smirk spread across his face. "What are you going to do about it, little girl?" he sneered. "This is our tavern now." With that, the other men laughed, some even raising their mugs in a mock salute to the girl who dared stand up to them. The young woman, however, didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step back, her hand brushing the side of the counter where an old, weathered sword was resting. It was a sword that had seen countless battles, its edge still sharp despite the years of wear. Its hilt, once finely crafted, was worn smooth from use. It wasn't just any sword. It was her sword, the one thing that had kept her alive in a world that had long since forgotten mercy. The moment her fingers brushed the hilt, the room fell into a tense stillness. The air was thick with the promise of violence. The outlaws, sensing the shift, exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this. The scarred man released her arm, his eyes now wary. "You think you can use that thing?" he asked, his voice losing some of its bravado. The young woman, still holding the sword, took a slow breath. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, her movements deliberate. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, resolute calm. "I don't think," she said softly. "I know." The tavern grew eerily quiet as the tension between the young woman and the outlaws stretched thin. The once lively chatter and clinking of mugs had all but ceased, the patrons now watching in wide-eyed silence, their gaze shifting between the girl behind the counter and the rough men who had interrupted their peace. The scarred outlaw, his hands still hovering in the air as if to test the wind, grinned, though there was less confidence in his expression now. He was sizing her up, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read her. But he could not, and that frustrated him. She was different from what he had expected. Most women, hell, most men, would have buckled under the weight of his gaze, would have cowered or pleaded for mercy. But not this one. She stood there, perfectly still, like a statue. Yet something in her posture suggested a storm was waiting just beneath the surface. "You're making a mistake," he said after a long pause, his voice much quieter now. It was more of a growl than a boast. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on him, her fingers still wrapped around the hilt of the sword. Every muscle in her body was poised, tense, coiled, ready to strike. Her gaze flicked toward the door behind him for a split second, then back to the group. She was calculating the odds, the positions, the exits. Everything was clear in her mind, as it always was when it came to a fight. But there was something else, something quieter within her. A familiar, icy resolve that threatened to crack through the surface, one she had learned to bury long ago. It was the same feeling she had every time someone tried to take what was hers or threaten the world she had fought so hard to build. And this tavern, this simple refuge of comfort and warmth, was hers. The scarred man leaned forward, his hand falling to the dagger at his belt, his fingers twitching in anticipation. The others were watching now, sensing that something was about to break. "You want to die, girl?" he sneered. "Because you're going to. Just a matter of when." The young woman's lips parted, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though she might speak, perhaps to defuse the situation, perhaps to make her final stand. But instead, her hand slid from the sword's hilt and moved behind the counter, her fingers curling around a thin, silver-studded knife, something far more subtle but just as deadly. "Leave," she said, her voice cold, calm, but carrying an undeniable weight of finality. "This is your last warning." For a heartbeat, the tavern was utterly still. The crackling fire was louder than the breaths of the men. And then the scarred man let out a short, cruel laugh. "A warning," he scoffed. "This is your last chance, little girl. You don't get to make demands here." With that, he lunged. The others followed suit, drawing their knives and axes in unison, moving to encircle her. They had the advantage of numbers, the advantage of experience. They had taken down bigger targets than this little tavern girl, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The moment the scarred man's foot crossed the line into the tavern space, the young woman's movements were a blur. Her body shifted like water, flowing with an unnatural grace as she sidestepped his thrust. Her knife, a flash of silver in the dim light, was already in the air before he could fully comprehend her reaction. The blade bit deep into the outlaw's leader's wrist with a sickening crunch, the sound of steel slicing through bone. He howled in pain, his dagger falling to the floor with a clang. But the girl wasn't finished. In the same fluid motion, she drove her knee into his gut, sending him stumbling backward into his men, his breath knocked from his lungs. They were too slow. One of the men on her left swung his axe in a wide arc, but she ducked just under it, her movements a study in precision. She wasn't just fast. She was a master of distance, timing, and control. As his swing passed harmlessly over her, she closed the gap between them in a single step. Her knife found the artery of his throat in a swift motion, the blood spraying in an arc before he could even scream. The tavern floor was slick with it now, but she didn't pause. The remaining men hesitated, momentarily taken aback by her ruthless efficiency. But fear was a potent motivator. Another man, larger than the rest, roared and charged her, his axe raised high. The young woman didn't flinch. She knew what was coming. She spun on her heel, just out of the reach of the axe, and before he could adjust his stance, she drove her elbow into the side of his knee. The sickening crack of bone against bone was followed by the man collapsing, howling in pain as he dropped his axe. Before he could recover, she was on him, her knee driving into his chest, pinning him to the ground. Her silver knife pressed into his throat, and he froze. She didn't need to say anything. He could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. She would kill him if he made even the slightest move. Two of the remaining outlaws stood there, staring at her, terror overtaking their anger. They weren't used to this. They weren't used to being the hunted. "You," one of them began to stammer, but he didn't finish the sentence. His words faltered when he saw the dead-eyed calm in her face, the knife still glinting in the firelight. "Leave," she repeated, her voice as cold as steel. "Now." The two men backed away, their feet stumbling over the slick floor, their weapons shaking in their hands. They had no choice. The realization hit them hard. They were out of their league. The outlaws turned and fled, pushing each other through the door with as much haste as their fear would allow. Their boots echoed in the still night air, fading into the distance. The young woman stood alone in the tavern now, her breath steady, her heart calm. The only sound that remained was the crackling of the fire, the soft drip of blood onto the floor. The patrons, who had been too afraid to intervene, slowly began to breathe again. She wiped her blade on the edge of her apron, returning it to the sheath beneath the counter. With one final glance at the empty doorway, she went back to her work, as if nothing had happened at all. But everyone in the room knew something had changed. They had seen the true face of the quiet girl behind the counter, and they would never forget it. The air in the tavern was thick with the heavy silence of those who had just witnessed something extraordinary. The fire continued to crackle in the hearth, but its warmth now felt distant, almost foreign, as the room swirled in an undercurrent of disbelief. The patrons, farmers, traders, and travelers, who had once been oblivious to the presence of the quiet young woman behind the counter, were now looking at her with new eyes. They had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had heard the stories, the tales of a swordswoman so skilled that no one dared challenge her, whose name struck fear into the hearts of those who dared to cross her path. But those stories were always just that, stories. Fantasies whispered in the dark corners of inns and taverns, often dismissed as exaggerated lies. But now, they had seen it for themselves. The young woman, still standing near the counter, her apron now speckled with blood, took a slow breath. She straightened, smoothing her hair as if the events of the past few minutes hadn't just unfolded in a deadly dance of violence and precision. She turned to the patrons, who had all fallen silent, their wide eyes fixed on her. Her voice was soft, but firm, as she spoke into the stillness. "Is anyone else in need of something to drink?" Her words cut through the air, shattering the tension that had settled over the room like a thick fog. For a long moment, no one responded. It was as if the weight of what they had witnessed had frozen them all in place. But slowly, one by one, the patrons started to recover, their instinct to survive overriding the shock that gripped them. A few murmured among themselves, nodding in approval, but most remained still, unsure of what to make of the girl who had so effortlessly dispatched the group of thugs. The young woman, however, did not linger on their reactions. She wiped her hands on her apron once more, the blood already drying. The blade had been returned to its hidden sheath beneath her clothing, but the weight of it, the familiarity of it, remained with her. She had become something different in those moments, a force of nature, unstoppable and inevitable. And yet, as she glanced around the room, the truth of it all settled heavily in her chest. She had not sought this. She had not wanted this life. But the years had shaped her into something she could no longer deny. The door to the tavern creaked open again, and for a moment, everyone tensed, expecting more of the outlaws to return. But it wasn't them. It was a lone traveler, a man cloaked in a thick, weather-beaten coat, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. The man stepped inside, glancing around the room, his eyes flicking from face to face, stopping for only a moment on the girl behind the counter. There was something about him, something that suggested he wasn't just any traveler, wasn't just passing through like the others. The young woman straightened, feeling his gaze on her, and she instinctively reached for the small knife at her side. But the man did not approach. Instead, he moved toward an empty table by the window, settling down in the corner with a weary sigh. It was then that the first voice broke the silence. That was something, wasn't it?" the old man at the bar said, his voice shaking slightly as he lifted his mug. He took a swig, his hand still trembling. "Never thought I'd see the day. You did well, girl." She didn't respond right away, but nodded once. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the corner where the cloaked man sat. There was an odd feeling in her gut, a sense that something more was coming, something beyond the outlaws who had just fled. "I've seen a lot of fights in my time," the old man continued, oblivious to the girl's distraction, "but none like that. You've got the skill of a master. Ain't no doubt about it." A few of the other patrons nodded in agreement, their fear now replaced by a strange sort of admiration. The girl gave a small, tight smile. "It's just a knife and some quick thinking." Her voice was calm, as though it was nothing more than a passing errand. But inside, her thoughts churned. They are starting to notice. They will always notice. And soon, her hand brushed the counter again. A subconscious movement, but it felt oddly like an anchor, something to ground her amid the swirling unease. Her eyes flicked back to the man in the corner. Something about him was different. There was a stillness in him that mirrored her own, like he was waiting for something, just as she was. And then it came, the moment she had feared and yet expected. The man in the corner stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his boots silent against the floor as he walked toward the bar. He pulled his hood back, revealing his face. Sharp features, a narrow jaw, dark eyes that held a depth she couldn't place. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps not much older than herself. And yet, there was something in his gaze that suggested experience, a weight of the world she could almost feel in the air between them. He stopped just short of her, his eyes meeting hers, and for the briefest of moments, neither spoke. Then, he leaned forward slightly. "You're her, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. She didn't answer immediately, studying his face carefully, the steady rhythm of her heart grounding her. "Who?" she asked, her voice still cold but more guarded now. "The swordswoman," he replied, his lips curling into the faintest smile. "The one who walks in shadows, the one who never loses. I've heard the stories, and I've seen enough to know they're true." Her heart skipped a beat. He wasn't asking questions out of curiosity. He already knew. He was testing her. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, her voice a mix of challenge and suspicion. His smile widened, and for the first time, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. "Because I have a proposition for you." The room was still, the faint crackle of the fire the only sound breaking the tension that had settled between the young woman and the stranger at the bar. His words hung in the air, charged with something far deeper than a mere offer. She could feel it, the weight of his gaze as he studied her, waiting for her response. The patrons, their curiosity piqued but their fear still fresh from the recent conflict, glanced nervously between the two of them. It wasn't often that strangers walked into this tavern with such purpose, and certainly not with the kind of self-assuredness that this man exuded. They might have been afraid to speak, but they were listening, waiting for what would happen next. The girl, her back still straight, her hand unconsciously brushing against the knife at her waist, did not flinch. She had faced down the toughest men before. She had fought for her life more times than she could count. But something about this man felt different, more dangerous, more calculating. His words didn't hold the same bluster or empty bravado that the outlaws had carried. This man was measured, deliberate. She took a breath, her gaze flicking back to his dark eyes. "A proposition," she echoed, her voice steady, but her mind racing. She was no stranger to deals or offers, but this one felt different. Something told her this wouldn't be a simple matter of coins or work. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts. "Yes," the man said, his voice low, but with a hint of a smile still playing at the edges of his mouth. He didn't seem intimidated by her presence, even after seeing her dispatch the outlaws with such brutal efficiency. In fact, he seemed more intrigued than anything. "You've earned a reputation, and I've heard things about your skill, your strength. You don't get to be known like that unless you've got something exceptional behind you." Her pulse quickened slightly, but she didn't let it show. "And what does that have to do with you?" she asked, keeping her voice calm, even as the instinct to prepare herself for a potential threat hummed in her chest. The man leaned a little closer, his tone dropping lower, as if sharing a secret. "I have a job for you. A very important job. One that no one else in this kingdom could pull off." His eyes searched hers, looking for any sign that she was interested, or at least curious. She didn't respond immediately. Her thoughts were swirling, but she kept her expression unreadable. A job? No one else could pull it off? The words echoed in her mind, raising the hairs on the back of her neck. She had learned, in her solitary existence, to be wary of promises that sounded too good to be true. The man, sensing her hesitation, spoke again, this time with more urgency. "I'm not offering you riches. I'm not offering you power. What I'm offering is the chance to make a real difference. There's something happening in the kingdom, something that could change the balance of everything. You've got the skills to be a part of it, a bigger part than you've ever imagined." For a moment, she allowed herself to let the words hang in the air. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, her mind racing through the possibilities. What could he mean? The kingdom was already in turmoil. Wars, uprisings, and betrayal ran deep beneath the surface. But no one had dared challenge the established power. What kind of difference could this man be talking about? "You're wasting my time," she said flatly, her voice taking on a hint of steel. "If you're not here to drink, leave." The man, unfazed by her rejection, simply smiled, unfurling a small scroll from his cloak and sliding it toward her. "I think you'll want to read this." She stared at the scroll for a long moment, her hand hovering over it, but she didn't reach for it immediately. She wasn't some naive fool. She knew how these things went. If she took it, there was no going back. And yet, the uncertainty gnawed at her. What did he know? What had he heard? She looked back at him, eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands?" "No," he said calmly, his smile widening as though he had expected the question. "I think you'll take it because you'll recognize the truth in it, the truth of what you are, and what you could become." She reached out, slowly unsealing the scroll with a flick of her fingers. It felt like the weight of the world shifted slightly as she unrolled it. Her breath held. The letters were elegantly scrawled, but they held a promise, a challenge, a call to action. As she read, her brow furrowed. The words painted a picture of a dangerous, covert mission, one that would take her to the heart of the kingdom's inner turmoil. A group of traitors, desperate to overthrow the throne, were gathering in secret. The man knew this, and more importantly, he knew the precise location and the players involved. The kind of information that could make or break an entire kingdom. And at the heart of it, the scroll said, lay a single question. Would she be the one to stop them, or would she let the kingdom fall? Her eyes flicked back to the man, who was now watching her with a knowing look. "What's the catch?" she asked quietly, her voice betraying none of the wariness she felt creeping up her spine. "No catch," he replied simply. "Just a chance to choose your fate." She paused, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She knew what this meant. She knew what kind of person this man was. He wasn't just offering her a mission. He was offering her something far greater, the chance to leave behind the life she had known. A part of her hesitated. Could she trust him? Was this really the opportunity it seemed, or was it just another trap? But there was a deeper part of her that spoke louder than the doubts. The part that had lived through years of solitude, of training, of running from the past. She was not just a waitress. She was not just a girl behind a counter. She was something more. And this man knew it. "I'll do it," she said, the words leaving her lips with an authority she didn't know she had. The man nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. Good. I'll be in touch. And with that, he stood, offering a final glance over his shoulder before walking out of the tavern, leaving her with the weight of his proposition and the knowledge that her life was about to change forever. The tavern door closed behind the man with a soft, almost reluctant creak. The silence in the room lingered for a long moment, the air thick with the uncertainty of what had just transpired. The young woman stood still, the scroll now resting on the counter before her. Its weight was heavy in her hands, not because of its physical substance, but because of the potential it carried, the weight of the decision she had just made. Her fingers traced the edges of the parchment, the ink on the scroll still fresh, the letters vivid against the aged paper. The words were now burned into her mind, a permanent reminder of what lay ahead. She glanced around the tavern once more. The patrons had resumed their conversations, though the energy had shifted. Their eyes occasionally flicked toward her, but no one dared to speak. They had seen her kill without hesitation, and now they saw something else in her. A quiet determination, an air of finality that could not be ignored. No longer just the girl behind the bar, no longer just the quiet, unassuming figure who served drinks. She was someone else now, someone different. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows across the room. She glanced at the door once more, the memories of the fight with the outlaws flashing briefly through her mind. It had been instinct, a culmination of years of survival. But this was different. This would require every ounce of the skill, the focus, and the precision she had honed over the years. Her heart still beat steadily, the adrenaline from the earlier confrontation now ebbing away, but there was a new pulse inside her, a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. Her fingers tightened around the scroll again. What am I doing? She hadn't wanted this life. She hadn't wanted the violence, the bloodshed, but it was a life she had been born into, whether she liked it or not. There had always been a part of her that longed for something more, something beyond the simple, quiet existence she had forged for herself behind this bar. But she had always feared what might happen if she allowed herself to reach for it. Now, the choice had been made for her. She had never been one to dwell on her decisions. The world had always been too dangerous, too unforgiving, to let her thoughts wander for too long. And yet, this moment felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that this man, this stranger who had walked in from the cold night, had not just seen something in her. He had awakened something. The door creaked open once again, and she instinctively reached for the knife at her side. But it was only a young man, no older than 18, who entered with a nervous glance around the room. He walked up to the counter, his eyes catching hers for a brief moment before he hurriedly ordered a drink. His presence, in contrast to the outlaws and the stranger, was almost inconsequential. But in that moment, he served as a reminder that the world outside the tavern hadn't stopped. Life was still moving forward, whether she was ready or not. She poured him his drink, her hands moving on their own, her thoughts still on the scroll that lay in front of her. "You okay?" the young man asked quietly, his voice tentative as he glanced up at her. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She blinked, forcing herself to return to the present. She offered him a smile, though it was more out of habit than genuine warmth. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice cool but not unkind. The young man nodded, though his unease remained. He paid for the drink, glancing at her once more before retreating to a quiet corner of the room. She watched him for a moment, then turned back to the counter. The quiet of the tavern felt heavier now, as though something had shifted in the very air. The world outside was a place of danger, of turmoil. She had lived through it, learned to survive it, but had never truly taken part in it. Not like this. But that was about to change. She had been offered a chance to fight, to shape the future of her kingdom, to take her place among the forces that moved in the shadows. She knew there would be no turning back from this path. There would be no more hiding behind the counter, no more blending into the background. If she accepted the stranger's proposition, she would be exposed. Her skills, her history, everything she had tried to keep buried. The very thing she had feared all her life. And yet, a part of her had always known this day would come. A heavy sigh escaped her lips, and she pushed the scroll aside, letting her hands rest on the counter. I've always known this day would come, she thought again, the truth settling in her chest. It was time. Time to leave this life behind. Time to stop running from the past. The choice had been made. Hours later, the night had fully fallen, and the tavern was quiet once again. The last few patrons had drifted off into the dark, leaving only the flickering firelight and the occasional sounds of the night beyond. The young woman stood behind the bar, cleaning glasses, her thoughts still focused on the decision she had made. She had one more night here, one more night of relative peace before the storm would come crashing down. The door opened once again, and this time, it wasn't the young traveler or a group of outlaws. This time, it was someone she knew, someone who had been part of her life before the quiet of the tavern had swallowed her whole. It was a man dressed in a heavy cloak, his face partially hidden by a hood. But there was no mistaking the cold eyes that met hers. "You took the job, didn't you?" he asked, his voice gruff, as though he already knew the answer. She didn't respond right away. She simply studied him, watching his every movement, feeling the weight of his presence in the room. Her past had come calling, and with it, the future. The man stood in the doorway, his cloak slightly torn from the long journey, his eyes dark and sharp, filled with the unmistakable weight of years spent in the shadow of the world's darker corners. He was older than the young woman, his hair graying at the temples, though his movements still carried a fluidity that betrayed his age. He was a man who had lived through enough to know that nothing ever came without cost. She didn't have to ask who he was. She already knew. This was a man from her past, the one who had taught her how to survive, how to fight, how to kill when necessary. He had been more than a mentor. He had been a part of her life before the quiet days behind the bar had taken hold. But those days, those quiet days, had long since slipped away. Now, he had returned, just as he always did, at the moment when she could least afford to look back. "Did you come to stop me?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth, though there was a flicker of something like regret, or perhaps understanding, in her chest. She had been expecting this confrontation for days, if not weeks. After all, there were only so many paths to walk, and the one she had chosen was bound to lead her back to him. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes lingering on her for a long moment, as though studying her in the same way he had when they first met. He had been the one to teach her everything she knew, to train her when she was nothing more than a street urchin with a knife and an old sword. He had shaped her into what she was today. And now, after all this time, it was as though she had never left his grasp. "You always knew this day would come," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of disuse. "You're not one to run forever." She didn't flinch at his words. There was a truth to them, one that had always hovered in the back of her mind. She couldn't escape what she was, no matter how many taverns she hid behind, or how many people she served drinks to. The blood, the violence, it was a part of her. And so long as she ran from it, it would continue to chase her, always a step behind, never letting her forget who she truly was. "Why are you here?" she asked again, more forcefully this time. She didn't need a lecture from him, not now. She had already made her choice. "I've got a job to do. That's why I took the man's offer. That's why I'm leaving. I'm done hiding. I'm done being quiet." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the man seemed to consider them. His gaze flicked briefly toward the scroll on the counter, the one that had been the catalyst for her decision. He knew what it meant. "I see," he muttered, taking a step closer to the bar, his eyes hardening. "I always knew you'd be more than this, more than just a girl behind a counter. But I'm not sure you understand what you're getting yourself into. There are things in this world, things darker than you can imagine, that will chew you up and spit you out without a second thought. And that job, the one you've just agreed to, will lead you straight into their jaws." She didn't flinch at his words, but inside, his warning gnawed at her. She had known that the path she was about to walk wouldn't be easy. There would be dangers, betrayals, and losses. But she had never been afraid of the shadows. They were a part of her life. She had spent enough time in them to know how to survive. "And what do you think I should do?" she asked, her voice quiet, yet cutting. "Stay here? Hide from the world?" Pretend I'm just another barmaid in a quiet tavern? Because I've tried that. I've tried to run from who I am, but it's not enough. I can't hide anymore. Not from myself. Not from the world. Her words struck a chord with him. He knew what she meant. They had both lived that life. The one where every day was about survival, about staying one step ahead of the danger that was always just around the corner. But now, she had made her choice. She was no longer running. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. I never thought you'd want this life again, he muttered, his voice lowering. But I can't say I'm surprised. You've always been stubborn. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze softening slightly. I don't want this life, she said quietly, but I want something more than what I've had. And if that means facing whatever comes next, then so be it. I won't hide anymore. The man seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes flicking to the door, then back to her. You're not the same girl I knew. You've changed. I can see it in your eyes. She didn't respond, her hands steady as she wiped down the counter. There was no turning back now. She had already crossed the point of no return. The stranger's proposition was just the beginning. The man was silent for a long time, and the young woman could feel the weight of his gaze on her. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer, almost reluctantly. I won't stop you, he said, his words heavy with something she couldn't quite place. But you should know this, girl. The road you're walking down will be a bloody one. And once you start down it, there's no turning back. You'll either finish the job or you'll die trying. She looked at him, meeting his gaze head-on. I've already made my peace with that. The man nodded slowly, as if acknowledging some unspoken understanding between them. He turned toward the door, his cloak trailing behind him as he made his way back into the night. Good luck, he muttered, before stepping out into the darkness. She watched him go, a sense of finality settling over her. The past had caught up with her, but it no longer had the power to control her. She had made her choice. She was no longer the girl who hid behind the bar. She was a sword in the darkness. The door to the tavern clicked shut behind the man, and the quiet girl, now no longer just a quiet barmaid, stood alone in the dim room. The fire crackled in the hearth, but there was no warmth in the light now. Everything felt distant, as if the world outside had already begun to turn its back on her. She stood there, her hands resting on the counter, staring at the empty door through which the man had just exited. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Once you start down that road, there's no turning back. She knew it was true. She knew the world she was about to walk into would demand things of her. Things she had hoped to leave behind. Things she feared would strip away the last vestiges of the person she once was. But there was no other path for her now. No way to undo what she had set into motion. No way to unmake the choice she had already made. With a heavy sigh, she turned away from the counter and began to gather the last of her things. She moved quickly and methodically, as though the physical task would help banish the gnawing unease that threatened to consume her. The scroll remained on the counter, its contents now embedded in her mind. She had never been one to wait. Not for anything. Not for anyone. And tonight, there would be no delay. She needed to leave. The quiet life she had built in the tavern had been a facade, one that had fooled even her into believing she could outrun her past. But she couldn't. Not anymore. The night outside had fallen deep into darkness when she made her way out of the tavern, the cool wind biting at her skin. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the world in a blanket of shadow. She drew her cloak tighter around herself, the familiar weight of the sword beneath her clothing a reassuring presence against her side. The night felt like an old friend, the silence and stillness something she knew well. But tonight, it felt different. There was an edge to it, a foreboding that pricked at her skin. She moved swiftly, her boots silent on the damp earth, her steps taking her farther and farther from the tavern. She didn't look back. In the distance, the lights of the city twinkled, faint and distant. She had been to the city before, of course. It was the center of commerce and politics in the kingdom, a place of wealth and power, but also of corruption and deceit. It was there that the traitors, the conspirators, the ones who had made the kingdom a dangerous place, had gathered. And it was there that she would make her stand. But before she could face them, Before she could confront the forces that threatened to tear the kingdom apart, she had to prepare herself. She had to gather information, make alliances, and, perhaps most importantly, reconnect with her own skills. The fight ahead would not be easy. It would be more than just a battle for survival. It would be a battle for her soul. As she neared the outskirts of the city, the air seemed to grow colder, as if the very earth itself sensed the storm that was coming. She paused for a moment, standing at the edge of the forest, where the trees whispered in the wind. Her hand instinctively moved to the hilt of her sword, her fingers tracing the worn leather. It had been with her for years. It had seen blood, death, and survival. But the coming battle would be different. This time, it wouldn't just be her life at stake. She didn't know how long she stood there, her mind swirling with the weight of her decision. The world seemed to press in on her, the quiet of the night amplifying her thoughts. But as the silence grew heavier, she felt it, an unsettling presence, one that crept in from the shadows. Her body tensed immediately, her senses on high alert. She wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping silently into the moonlight. The figure was cloaked, their face hidden beneath a hood. They moved with the same predatory grace she had learned to recognize. Every step measured, every motion calculated. For a moment, they simply stood there, studying her, their presence a cold weight in the air. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, their voice soft, yet carrying an unmistakable authority. She didn't flinch. Instead, her hand rested on the sword at her side, her fingers gripping the hilt with quiet resolve. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to explain herself. The sword was enough. The figure took a step closer, and only then did she recognize something in their posture, something familiar. She had seen this walk before. This confidence, this mastery of movement. "You've come to stop me, haven't you?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was a slight tension in the way she held herself. She was ready for anything, but her heart beat just a little faster. The figure chuckled, the sound almost like a sigh, as though they had expected this reaction. "No, I've come to help you." She blinked, surprised. "Help me? You've come to stop me from going after the traitors? To stop me from fulfilling my mission?" The figure shook their head. "No, I've come to offer you an alliance. To join forces." Her brow furrowed. "And why would I do that?" The figure's hood shifted, revealing just enough of their face for her to see the glint of a smile. "Because you're not the only one who has been watching. You're not the only one who knows what's happening in this kingdom. There's more to this than just your mission, little swordswoman. The traitors? They're just the beginning." For a brief moment, her breath caught. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when her past and her future collided, when the world would see who she truly was. But this man, this stranger, offered her something more. An alliance. A chance to join forces. "I don't need allies," she replied firmly, her voice full of conviction. "I've been alone for too long to trust anyone." The figure didn't seem offended by her words. Instead, they simply nodded, as though they had expected this answer. "Perhaps," they said, "but you're not as alone as you think." The figure remained motionless in the shadows, their cloak billowing slightly in the cool wind. The words they had spoken hung in the air between them, the weight of their meaning sinking in slowly. For a brief moment, everything felt suspended, as though the world had paused in anticipation. She could feel her heart beat steadily in her chest, the familiar rhythm of a predator awaiting its next move. The figure took another step closer, and for the first time, she allowed herself to examine them fully. They were tall, with the broad shoulders of someone who had seen battle, their cloak draped loosely around their frame. But there was something more, a confidence that radiated from them, something that spoke of an even greater power lurking beneath the surface. "You know who I am," the figure said, breaking the silence with a voice that was low but resonant. "And you know what I'm capable of." She didn't answer immediately. She had heard the rumors, whispers that had reached her ears even in the quiet corners of the kingdom. The name they spoke of was one she had heard many times, one that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who had dared to oppose it. But this was not the time for doubts, not for hesitation. Instead, She simply studied the figure before her hands steady on the hilt of her sword. "I know what you've done," she said, her voice unyielding, "but I don't trust easily. You must have a reason for offering me an alliance. What's in it for you?" The figure's smile grew, but it was not the smile of a man who was amused. It was one that conveyed a depth of understanding, as though they had seen far beyond the surface of things. "What's in it for me?" they repeated, their voice a quiet hum. "Isn't that the same question you should be asking yourself?" She narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," the figure said, stepping closer, their presence now almost overwhelming. "You've already made your choice. You're going after the traitors. You've chosen to face the forces that are tearing the kingdom apart, and you'll do it alone, unless you choose otherwise. You'll need help. You'll need more than just a sword to survive the storm that's coming." She felt a spark of annoyance flare within her. "I can handle myself," she snapped. "I've always handled myself." The figure didn't flinch. "And yet here you are, talking to me, considering my offer," they said calmly. "The truth is, you're not as alone as you think. The storm is much bigger than the traitors you've been tracking. There are forces in play that even you couldn't anticipate. They're the ones pulling the strings, and they'll use you just as easily as they'll use anyone else." Her grip tightened around the hilt of her sword, and for a moment, she felt her patience beginning to slip away. She had no time for riddles. She had no time for games. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "And why should I trust you?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as though considering her words. They didn't seem offended, nor did they seem surprised by her hostility. "You shouldn't trust me," they said simply. "You shouldn't trust anyone. But that doesn't mean you can't use me." She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm. She had never been one to rely on anyone but herself, and the thought of depending on someone else made her uneasy. The past had taught her that alliances were fleeting, that even those closest to you could betray you when it suited them. But the figure's words rang in her ears. "You'll need more than just a sword to survive the storm." Her mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle she had been trying to solve falling into place. She had already made one decision, taking on the traitors, fighting for the kingdom. But this was different. This was an opportunity to step into a larger world, one where the stakes were higher, and the consequences of failure were far more severe. She could feel the pull, the weight of the unknown, drawing her in. "Why should I work with you?" she asked again, her voice quiet but steady. "What do you want from me?" The figure smiled again, this time more enigmatically. "All I want is for you to understand that there's more to this war than what meets the eye. You can't stop what's coming alone, but together, we might stand a chance." She considered this for a moment, the silence hanging between them like a thread stretched taut. Her instinct screamed at her to walk away, to keep to the course she had set. But there was something in the figure's voice, something in the way they carried themselves, that told her they weren't bluffing. Finally, she nodded slowly. "What's the plan?" The figure's smile softened, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Good. We start by getting information. You know where the traitors are, but you don't know who is backing them. You don't know who the true enemies are. We'll find that out together." She hesitated for only a moment before answering. "And how do we find this information?" The figure stepped closer, their voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a man in the city, a contact of mine. He's one of the few who knows the truth. We'll need to find him first. But be warned, he's not someone who can be trusted easily. He's as dangerous as the people we're hunting." She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "And you think I'm ready for that?" The figure's gaze met hers, unwavering. "I think you're more than ready. But the question is, do you trust yourself enough to face the truth?" Her heart beat just a little faster, but her voice remained firm. "I'm ready." The figure nodded, satisfied with her answer. "Then let's begin." As they turned to leave, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the young woman could feel the weight of the choice she had just made settle into her bones. There would be no going back now. The path she had chosen was dark and uncertain, but it was the only one that led to the answers she sought, and she would face whatever came with the same resolve that had seen her through every battle before. The night air grew colder as they made their way deeper into the forest, the ground beneath their boots soft with the dampness of the evening. The quiet girl, now walking alongside the cloaked figure, felt the tension of the moment grow heavier with every step. She had made her decision. There was no turning back now. She had chosen a path that would lead her into unknown territory, into the heart of the kingdom's darkest secrets. And though part of her still wrestled with doubt, another part, the part that had long ago learned to trust her instincts, knew this was the right choice. The cloaked figure led the way with quiet precision, their footsteps almost inaudible as they moved through the dense underbrush. The young woman kept a careful distance, her senses heightened, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Despite the quiet, her mind was racing, her thoughts still catching up with the rapid decisions she had made. She glanced sideways at her companion. The figure was a mystery, someone who had appeared out of nowhere, offering an alliance she hadn't asked for, hadn't even considered. Their motives were unclear, their trustworthiness even more so. But there was something in their demeanor that suggested they knew more than they let on. They had seen the dangerous game she was about to play, and perhaps they had been watching her for longer than she realized. "How much do you know about the traitors?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence, the question heavy on her mind. The cloaked figure didn't look back, but their voice was calm, unruffled by her inquiry. "Enough to know they're not just a handful of rebels. They've been working with forces that go deeper than you might think. Their reach extends beyond the kingdom. You've seen the signs, the unrest, the rumors. But the true enemy is far more elusive." Her brow furrowed as she processed their words. "And you know who they are?" She kept her voice steady, but the question lingered in the back of her mind. If they had been watching long enough to offer her an alliance, they surely knew more than she did about the true scope of the danger. The figure slowed for a moment, their silhouette barely visible in the dark. "I have suspicions, but we need more information. The man we're going to see, he's the one who knows what's truly at stake. He's been feeding both sides, playing the game for years. If anyone knows who's behind this conspiracy, it's him." The young woman's grip on her sword tightened. "And this man? How do we trust him?" The cloaked figure didn't answer right away. When they spoke again, their voice was low, almost resigned. "We don't. But we don't have a choice. The truth we seek is hidden behind layers of deception. And he holds the key." A sense of unease settled over her. She had never been one to trust anyone easily, and now she was being asked to trust a man she had never met, someone whose motives were just as murky as her allies. But she had no other option. The stakes were too high. "How do you know he'll even talk to us?" she asked, pushing the doubt aside as best she could. The figure glanced over their shoulder briefly, their face still hidden beneath the shadow of their hood. "He'll talk to me. He owes me a favor," they said simply. "But if you think this will be easy, you're wrong. There are no easy answers in this game. Not for you, and certainly not for him." She nodded, the weight of their words settling in. They were walking into a den of thieves and spies, and every step forward was a step deeper into a web she wasn't sure she could untangle. But she had no choice. She had already crossed that line when she made the decision to face the traitors head-on. The city loomed ahead, the distant glow of lanterns flickering through the trees as they neared its edge. It was an unsettling sight. The city, once a place of bustling markets and vibrant life, now felt cold and oppressive. The streets were quieter than usual, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of a door creaking or a faraway shout. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with fear, with the anticipation of something darker yet to come. As they reached the outskirts of the city, the cloaked figure turned to her. "The contact is inside the city's walls," they said. "We'll need to be careful. The city's not as safe as it used to be. The traitors have eyes everywhere." She nodded again, her resolve hardening with every word. She had never been afraid of danger. She had faced it countless times before, and she would face it again now. But this felt different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something bigger, something that could change everything she had known. The cloaked figure led her through a narrow alley, their steps light but deliberate. She followed closely behind, keeping her hand near her sword, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. The city's familiar streets now felt foreign to her, the once comforting hum of life replaced by an eerie stillness. As they approached a small, unmarked building tucked away in the corner of the alley, the figure stopped. "This is it," they said quietly. "Stay close. This man doesn't like to be disturbed." The young woman's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what to expect inside, but the weight of the situation pressed down on her. This was it, the first step toward the answers she needed. But was she ready for what she was about to uncover? The figure knocked softly on the door, their movements precise. There was a pause, a moment of stillness, before a voice from inside called out, "Who's there?" The figure didn't answer immediately. They simply waited, their body tense, ready for anything. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. The man they had come to see stood in the doorway, his face gaunt, his eyes shadowed with weariness and suspicion. He eyed the cloaked figure with a mixture of recognition and caution before turning his gaze to the young woman standing behind them. "Come in," he muttered, stepping aside. Without a word, the cloaked figure entered, the young woman following closely behind. The door closed quietly behind them, and the darkness of the room seemed to swallow them whole. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, sealing them in the dimly lit room. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of old wood and stale air, as though the room had not been disturbed in years. A single, flickering candle sat on a small table, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The man who had opened the door stepped aside, his tired eyes watching them with a mixture of wariness and resignation. He was older than she had expected, his face worn and drawn, like someone who had lived too many lives and seen too many things. The wrinkles around his eyes were deep, etched into his face from years of worry. His hands, resting lightly on the table, were gnarled with age and wear. But it wasn't just age that marked him. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, an awareness of the world that made it clear he wasn't a man who had lived by accident. The cloaked figure who had brought her here moved forward first, standing just a few paces from the table. The young woman followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the room for any hint of danger. She didn't trust this place or this man, but there was no other choice now. They had come this far. The man at the table didn't speak immediately. He simply watched them, his eyes flicking between the cloaked figure and the young woman standing at the door. He seemed to be sizing them up, as though weighing the worth of their presence. "I didn't think you'd come back," the man said after a long moment, his voice hoarse but clear. "Not after everything. You've been gone a long time." The cloaked figure didn't respond right away. Instead, they reached into their cloak, producing a small vial, filled with a thick, dark liquid. The man's gaze shifted immediately, his posture stiffening as he watched the vial. It was an unusual gesture, one that seemed to carry weight, something between an offer and a warning. "You owe me," the cloaked figure said quietly, placing the vial on the table. "And I've come to collect." The man's eyes narrowed as he studied the vial, then turned his attention back to the figure. "You think you can buy my help with that?" he asked, his voice laced with a quiet bitterness. "You think you can just walk in here after all this time and expect me to play along? Help me, and you'll get what's in that vial," the cloaked figure said, their tone unwavering. "You owe me more than you care to admit." The man looked at the vial again, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem pleased, but there was something in his eyes that suggested the contents of that small bottle held more value than words could describe. After a long pause, he exhaled sharply, like a man who had made a decision he hadn't wanted to make. "Fine," he muttered, shaking his head as if annoyed by the very necessity of the situation. "But don't think this means I'm doing you any favors. You still owe me more than this." The cloaked figure didn't respond, but the young woman could feel the tension in the air. There was more to this exchange, more than either of them were willing to say. She could feel the weight of their history pressing down on the room, making everything feel more fragile. The man finally gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," he ordered, his tone flat. "Let's get to it." The young woman didn't hesitate, but her movements were cautious as she took a seat. She watched the man closely, her senses alert. The room felt smaller now, more claustrophobic, as though the answers she had been seeking for so long were just out of reach. She had come here for information. About the traitors, about the people pulling the strings, about what was really going on behind the scenes. But the questions swirling in her mind had only grown sharper since entering this room. The cloaked figure took a seat beside her, their attention fixed on the man. There was a silence, a moment of stillness before the man finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years of knowledge and secrecy. "You've come to the right place," he said slowly, his eyes flicking to the cloaked figure and then to the young woman. "But you're asking the wrong questions." The young woman furrowed her brow, confusion creeping in. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tense. "I'm looking for the truth. About the traitors, about who's behind this entire conspiracy. I need to know who is pulling the strings." The man leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping against the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "It's not as simple as you think," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You're right about one thing. The traitors are just the surface. They're nothing but pawns in a much larger game. But the ones behind it all? They're not the ones you're looking for. They're the ones who control everything, who have been controlling everything for far longer than you realize." She felt her pulse quicken. "Who are they?" The man's lips curled into a faint, cynical smile. "You're asking the wrong question again," he repeated. "You want names. You want to know who is behind this, who is orchestrating all of it. But the truth is, it doesn't matter who they are. What matters is what they control. And what they control is you." The words hit her like a slap to the face. The cold realization spread through her veins, and for a moment, she felt the ground shift beneath her. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "The traitors, they're just a symptom of a much deeper illness. There are powers at play here that you couldn't even begin to understand. Powers that have shaped this kingdom for centuries. And you, girl, you're part of their plan." She felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to let her fear show. She had come for answers, and she wasn't about to back down now. "So what is it you're offering me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of confusion swirling inside her. The man's eyes glinted in the dim light. "The truth," he said simply. "But the truth has a price. Are you willing to pay it?" She didn't hesitate. "I'll pay whatever it takes." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then listen carefully, because what you do next will decide everything. There's no turning back after this." The man's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they implied. The young woman, her hands still gripping the edge of the chair, felt a cold shiver run through her. The price of truth? What could that possibly mean? She had already crossed so many lines, made so many decisions that had taken her further from the quiet life she had once known. But this was different. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, as though the very air had turned against her. The cloaked figure beside her remained silent, their eyes fixed on the man, but they made no move to interrupt. The young woman knew better than to look for reassurance from them. They were just as much a part of this dangerous game as anyone else. But she also knew that the man had the answers she needed, the answers that could lead her to the traitors and, ultimately, to the forces that were pulling the strings from the shadows. She leaned forward, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. "What do you mean, the truth has a price?" she asked, her words deliberate. "I came here because I need answers. I didn't come here to be given riddles. If you know something, then tell me." The man stared at her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been regret or perhaps fear. But whatever it was gone before she could fully make sense of it. "You think you're ready for the truth?" he asked, his voice low, almost mocking. "You think that by asking for it, you're somehow prepared to face what's coming?" She didn't flinch. She had been through too much to let him undermine her resolve now. "I've faced worse than you can imagine," she said quietly. "I didn't come here to back away from a fight. I came here to end it." The man's lips twitched into something resembling a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're not just fighting the traitors," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice taking on a darker edge. "You're fighting an idea, a power that has been buried so deep in this kingdom's roots It's almost impossible to even begin to comprehend. You're not just fighting men or armies. You're fighting something older, something that controls everything. And once you know what that is, once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. And that girl is the price. She didn't understand at first. The words seemed to swirl around her, confusing her even more. But then the realization hit her. What he was telling her was more than just a warning. It was a warning about her own fate. Once she stepped into the light of truth, there would be no retreating into the darkness. She would be forced to act, forced to make choices that would change everything. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, her voice sharper now, more insistent. "If I pay this price, if I accept the truth, what do you get from it? What's your role in all of this?" The man studied her for a long moment, and the silence in the room seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "I get nothing," he said, his words heavy with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "I've already given everything I had to give. Now, I'm just trying to keep what's left of myself from being consumed by it all." The cryptic nature of his words only added to her unease. She didn't have time for games, not now. But as much as she wanted to press him for more, she knew she had to be patient. She was here for a reason, and if she wanted to make it out of this alive, she would need every shred of information he was willing to give. "You said there's a power," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm despite the questions that were piling up in her mind. "A force that's been pulling the strings. What is it? Who are they?" The man took a deep breath, his hands resting on the table in front of him. "The traitors you're chasing, they're just the surface. They're a distraction, a way to keep people like you busy while the true power works behind the scenes. And the ones behind it all, the ones who have been in control for centuries, they are not men. They are something older. They are the kingdom's true rulers. The ones who have controlled the flow of power, the wealth, and the bloodshed for generations." Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay still. This was what she had been searching for. She had known the kingdom's leaders weren't the only ones with power, but this was something else entirely. The rulers of the kingdom, the ones behind the throne, weren't even human? What did that mean? "You're telling me that the traitors are just pawns in a bigger game," she said, trying to digest the gravity of his words. "But what are these rulers? What do they want?" The man sighed, rubbing his forehead with one hand. "What they want is control. But not just any control. They want to reshape the world in their image. They want to bring about an era of power that has been lost to time. But to do that, they need to eliminate the old guard, people like the ones you've been chasing, and replace them with their own. And if they succeed, the kingdom will fall. Everything you've ever known will be erased, rewritten." Her mind raced as she processed the information. It was so much, so fast. The idea of the kingdom being controlled by a shadowy force, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, was overwhelming. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She had seen the unrest in the streets, the whispers in the alleys. She had felt the tension in the air. But could she stop it? She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "How do I stop them? How do I fight something like that?" The man met her gaze for the first time in what felt like an eternity, his eyes somber. "You can't fight them alone," he said softly. "You can't fight them at all unless you understand what they are. And the only way to truly understand them is to become part of their world." Her stomach twisted at his words. "What are you asking me to do?" He didn't answer immediately, but his silence was answer enough. Finally, he spoke again, his voice grave. "The price of truth is more than you realize. To stop them, you'll have to take a step into their world. You'll have to let them see you. And when that happens, there will be no turning back. You'll be just as much a part of their game as they are." She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said, her voice cold with resolve. "I'm not afraid of them." The man's eyes softened, just for a moment, before he nodded. "Then we begin." The weight of the decision settled into her bones like the chill of a long winter night. The man's words lingered in her mind. "You'll have to become part of their world." It was a daunting, terrifying thought, and for a moment, she questioned whether she had truly understood the gravity of what she was about to do. But there was no turning back. She had already chosen her path, and there was no room for fear now. Only resolve. The room around her seemed to close in, the candlelight flickering and casting shadows that danced along the walls like specters of the past, ghosts of choices long since made. The man at the table watched her with a knowing look in his eyes, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he saw more in her than she had intended to reveal. "You'll need more than just your sword," he said, his voice soft but carrying an edge of finality. "The path you're on won't be one with brute force. You'll need allies, yes, but you'll also need to think differently. Strategically." The young woman stood, her hand instinctively moving toward her sword, as if the weight of its presence might steady her. "I've never relied on anyone but myself," she replied, her voice calm, but her mind racing. "I'm not about to start now." The man nodded slowly, as though he had expected this response. "I understand, but mark my words, you will be tested. The powers behind the traitors are far more dangerous than anything you've ever faced. They can see everything, know everything, and they won't hesitate to crush you the moment you step into their sights." She didn't flinch. She had faced the deadliest men in the kingdom, outwitted thieves and assassins, survived when others would have fallen. She had made it this far. "Then I'll make sure they don't see me coming," she said, her words laced with quiet defiance. The man looked at her for a long time, then let out a resigned sigh. "Perhaps that's the only way, but you'll need more than just stealth. You'll need to understand the game they're playing. The only way to do that is to infiltrate their ranks, become someone they trust." He leaned forward, his hands pressed to the table. "Are you willing to go that far?" Her mind spun with the possibilities. Infiltrate their ranks, become someone they trust. Was she prepared to go that deep? Could she really step into a world where everything, every breath, every word, every move, would be a calculated risk? "Yes," she said after a moment, her voice firm. "I'll do what it takes." The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded as if he had made up his mind. "Good. Because once you step into their world, you'll be no longer a part of the world you once knew. You'll be a piece on their board, and you'll have to play their game to survive." His words hung in the air like a bitter truth, but the young woman didn't let herself falter. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. "Where do I start?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with urgency. The man hesitated, then reached into his cloak, pulling out a small, folded map. He placed it on the table between them, the edges worn and stained with age. The map was not of the city, nor of any land she recognized. Instead, it depicted a series of secret locations, hidden places within the kingdom, places where the ruling power was said to gather, places where the strings were pulled. "These are the places they'll never expect you to look," he said, tapping the map lightly. "You'll need to start here, in the heart of their operations. But you'll have to move quickly. Once you make your move, there will be no coming back. They'll be watching." She looked down at the map, studying the locations marked with small, deliberate symbols. The places were scattered throughout the kingdom, but one stood out in particular. A small, remote village, nestled between mountains and dense forests. It was a place she had never heard of, but something about it felt important. "Why there?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "What's in that village?" The man's face grew darker, and he spoke in a low, guarded tone. "That's where they gather their most trusted allies. The leaders of the traitor faction are there, waiting for the signal to strike. If you want to stop them, you'll need to find out who's backing them. And you'll need to do it without them knowing you're there." The idea of sneaking into a nest of enemies, of getting close to the very heart of the conspiracy, sent a shiver through her. But the resolve inside her only grew stronger. She had trained for moments like this. She had lived in the shadows, using them to her advantage. This would be no different. "I'll go," she said, folding the map carefully and tucking it into her coat. "I'll start there. But I'll need more than just information. If I'm going to stop them, I need to know who their allies are, what they're planning. You said the truth has a price. How do I get it?" The man's eyes gleamed in the dim light, his lips curling into a grim smile. "You'll get it through them. The leaders of the traitor faction won't just give you answers. You'll have to force them out, get them to reveal the truth, whatever it takes. And trust me, girl, that will require more than just your sword. It'll require something far darker." The young woman stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind focused and determined. She had come this far, and now there was no turning back. The truth was within reach, but it was shrouded in danger, hidden in the depths of the kingdom's most treacherous corners. "I understand," she said softly, "and I'll pay whatever price is necessary." The man's gaze softened just slightly, a trace of something like respect in his eyes. "Then you'd better move quickly. The longer you wait, the more dangerous it will get. They know you're coming." As she turned toward the door, her hand on the handle, she felt the weight of everything she was leaving behind. The quiet tavern, the simple life she had built, it was all slipping away now. She was about to walk into a world of darkness and deceit, where every step could lead to her death. But she had chosen this, and if the price of truth was steep, she would pay it, no matter what it took. With one final glance at the man, she stepped into the night. The night air outside the man's hidden room was thick and still, and the moon barely pierced through the heavy clouds that cloaked the sky. The young woman pulled her cloak tightly around her shoulders, the weight of the task ahead bearing down on her as she set off into the darkness. The road ahead was uncertain. Every step she took led her further into a world of shadows, a world she was still learning to navigate. She could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of something that loomed just out of reach, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The map was still folded in her coat, the inked symbols marking the places where the true power of the kingdom resided, hidden in plain sight. The remote village was her first destination, the first step into a world that had been kept secret for far too long. It was a place she had never heard of, tucked away in the mountains, a place where the traders and their allies gathered. It was there that the truth lay, wrapped in lies and deception. She walked through the empty streets of the city, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. The city, which had once felt like home, now felt like a maze of treachery and deceit. The lights from the windows flickered like dying stars, casting long shadows along the narrow alleys. She could feel the eyes of the kingdom's underbelly watching her, waiting for her to slip up, to make the wrong move. But she was no stranger to danger. She had lived in its grip for too long to be afraid of it now. She didn't know how long she had been walking, but as the city's outer gates came into view, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. The last traces of civilization were fading behind her, and before her stretched the wilderness, the unknown. Her heart beat steadily, but with every step she took away from the city, she felt herself slipping further into a different world. The world of the rulers. The road to the village was winding and treacherous, cutting through thick forests and steep hills. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the silence was oppressive. She had learned long ago to listen to the quiet. The silence spoke volumes, and right now, it spoke of danger, of eyes in the shadows, waiting to catch her off guard. The darkness of the woods seemed to swallow every sound, and for a moment, she wondered if the shadows themselves were closing in on her. But she pressed on. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, she reached the outskirts of the village. The place was smaller than she had imagined. Nothing more than a cluster of stone cottages tucked between the thick forest and the jagged mountain peaks. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. But it was the silence that struck her most. There was something unnatural about it. The village should have been alive with the sounds of morning, birds singing, animals moving. But there was nothing. The buildings were old, their stone walls weathered by time. But there was something unsettling about the way the village seemed to be frozen in place. No one moved. No one watched her approach. She stood at the edge of the village, her heart pounding in her chest, and she took in the surroundings. The path to the village was narrow and winding, but there were signs of life, or at least of activity. A few fresh footprints were visible in the dirt, leading toward one of the larger houses at the far end of the village. Her instincts kicked in. She was being watched. They were waiting for her. Her hand slid to the hilt of her sword, ready for whatever came next. The map she had been given told her this was where the traitor faction gathered, but it didn't tell her how they would react to her presence. If they were as careful as the man had implied, they would know she was coming. She had to be ready. She had to blend into the shadows, make herself invisible. She moved quickly, slipping into the alley between two buildings, her steps light as she kept to the edge of the village. She needed to get to the house the footprints led to, but she had to be careful. One wrong move, and her cover would be blown. She could feel the tension building inside her, the quiet thrum of adrenaline as her body prepared for whatever was coming. When she reached the house, she paused, hidden in the shadow of a nearby tree. It was a small structure, one of the largest in the village, but there was no sign of movement from within. The windows were dark, and the door was closed. Still, she could feel something that told her the answers were waiting inside. She crept closer, her every sense alert, and placed her hand on the door. It was cold to the touch, but not locked. She pushed it open, the creak of the hinges nearly deafening in the stillness of the village. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she steadied her breath as she slipped inside. The interior of the house was dim, lit only by the faintest light that filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. The air was thick with dust and the scent of stale smoke, but there was an odd sense of order to the place. Everything was neatly arranged. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a large wooden table sat in the center of the room. But there was no warmth to the place, no life, just the eerie stillness that seemed to pervade everything in this village. She moved further into the room, her boots making no sound on the wooden floor, her hands still resting on her sword. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of what she had come for. It didn't take long before she noticed it, a small, intricately carved box sitting on the table. The box seemed out of place, as though it didn't belong with the rest of the things in the room. It was almost inviting. She approached it cautiously, her fingers brushing the lid of the box. There was something about it, something that drew her in, and then, with a deep breath, she opened it. Inside, the box was empty, but the emptiness wasn't what startled her. No, it was the sharp, echoing sound of a voice in her head, a voice that spoke a single, chilling word. Run. The voice was not her own. It was not the man's. It was something else, something older, something darker. She snapped the box shut, her pulse racing as the words echoed in her mind. They weren't just watching her now. They knew exactly where she was, and they were waiting. The voice lingered in her mind, like a whisper that refused to be silenced. Run. The word echoed relentlessly, a command, a warning, and a promise all wrapped into one. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, her hands still resting on the box, but her body screaming for action. She had never been the type to wait for danger to find her. But this felt different. This was not the kind of enemy that could be outwitted or outrun. She slammed the box shut, her eyes darting toward the door, her senses now on high alert. She could feel it, the weight of the silence pressing in on her. The village, the house, everything around her was suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in. She didn't need to hear the footsteps. She didn't need to see the movement. She could feel the danger now, like a living presence in the air. Her heart pounded, her instinct screaming that she had overstayed her welcome. They knew she was here, and they would not let her leave without consequence. With a swift motion, she drew her sword, the familiar weight of the blade in her hand grounding her, but only for a moment. There was no time to hesitate. She moved to the window, drawing the curtains back just enough to see outside. The village lay in eerie stillness, the houses dark and empty. But in the distance, at the edge of the village, she saw movement, shadows shifting, people watching. They were waiting. Her pulse quickened. She knew they were coming for her. She had been careful, so careful, but it wasn't enough. The walls were closing in, and she was trapped in a village where no one would help her. No one even knew she was here. The voice had warned her, and now it was time to act. She turned toward the door, her mind racing through options. There was no way she could fight them all. Not in a village this small, with no reinforcements, no allies. The only way to survive was to slip away before they could surround her. Her eyes fell on a small door at the back of the room, hidden behind a bookshelf. She moved toward it, her feet silent on the wooden floor, her breath steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. She had to get out, and she had to do it quickly. She reached the door and tried the handle, relieved to find it unlocked. She stepped out into the alleyway behind the house, the sharp smell of pine and wet earth filling her lungs. The village was still, but the tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. She moved quickly, her mind focused on the map in her mind, the path she would need to take to get out of the village undetected. But she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay hidden. She had only moments before they would come looking for her. Her breath came faster as she reached the edge of the village, just beyond the last row of houses. She was almost out, almost free, but then she heard it. A rustle behind her, a footstep. She whirled around, her sword raised, ready for whatever came next. But there was nothing. The alleyway was empty. Her heart raced as she scanned the shadows. She had heard it. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been behind her, watching. And then she heard it again. A voice, soft but unmistakable, carried on the wind. "You can't escape." The words froze her in place. She spun around, but the alleyway remained empty. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was in the air, in her mind, in her chest. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She didn't have time to think. She ran. The sounds of pursuit came quickly behind her, soft at first, like the shuffle of boots in the dirt, but growing louder with each passing second. They were coming for her. She pushed herself harder, her breath ragged, her feet flying across the uneven ground. The trees ahead promised cover, but they were far away, and she knew they would catch up to her long before she could reach them. Run. The voice was louder now, clearer, and this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a command. The voice wanted her to run, and she had no choice but to obey. The thudding of boots grew louder behind her. She could hear them now, close enough to reach her with every step she took. But she was fast, faster than they anticipated. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her body, each step carrying her farther away from them. The trees were closer now, the cover within reach. But the village, no, the kingdom, was watching. They had eyes everywhere, and no matter how fast she ran, there would be no escaping the truth. She reached the tree line and darted between the trunks, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The world around her was nothing but darkness and the sound of her heartbeat, thudding like a drum in her ears. She was out of sight now, hidden in the thick forest. But the night was still alive with movement, with people who were hunting her. They would find her eventually. She had bought herself time, but it wouldn't be enough. She crouched behind a large tree, her hands still wrapped tightly around the hilt of her sword, and she waited. She didn't dare move, not yet. The footsteps grew closer, each one sending a ripple of fear through her. The shadows were moving. They were closing in. She wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else, but the feeling of being watched, the sensation that she was no longer alone in the woods, was impossible to ignore. Her heart raced, her thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. She had come here for the truth. She had come here to stop the traitors, to uncover the real power behind the kingdom's unrest. But now, she wasn't just fighting for answers. She was fighting for her life. And the shadows of the kingdom's darkest rulers were closing in fast. The forest around her seemed to come alive with every rustling leaf and creaking branch. It was as if the very trees themselves were shifting, leaning in to listen to the danger that was closing in. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the stillness, and she could feel their presence now, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Her breath caught in her chest, but she held her position, every muscle in her body coiled, ready to strike or flee, whichever came first. The silence of the night was shattered by a whisper, just a faint sound, like a breath on the wind. "We know you're here." The voice came from all around her. It wasn't just one person. It was as if they were speaking to her from the very air itself. The hairs on her arms stood up, a cold shiver running down her spine. The truth of what she had been chasing, the traitors, the conspirators, the rulers who held the strings of power, was beginning to unfold in ways she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a hunt for answers anymore. This was a battle for control over the very future of the kingdom, and she was caught in the eye of the storm. She could hear the movement now, faint steps around her, closing in on her position. They were searching for her, but they weren't rushing. They knew they had time. They knew she was trapped. Her fingers tightened around the hilt of her sword. She had been trained for moments like this, but there was something different this time. The enemy she faced was not just flesh and blood. It was something far more insidious, an unseen force watching from the shadows, pulling the strings of the world around her. She could feel it pressing in, suffocating her. They were everywhere, and they were not going to let her leave. "You can't escape us," the voice whispered again, sending a wave of cold dread through her. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It was cold, detached, and yet it felt too close, like it was speaking directly into her mind. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. Think, focus, move. She had been in worse situations. She had faced worse odds, but this felt different. The very air around her felt thick with malice, as though the forest itself had become an enemy. The footsteps continued to circle her, but they were careful now, deliberate. They knew she was somewhere nearby. The forest provided cover, but it wouldn't last forever. The walls were closing in. She shifted, making herself as small as possible, trying to blend into the darkness, but her senses told her they were moving closer. The trap was tightening around her. She had no illusions now. They were not just hunting her. They were playing with her. They wanted her to feel cornered. They wanted her to panic. But I won't give them that, she thought fiercely. She steadied her breath, watching for the slightest shift in the shadows. They were close now, but she didn't dare move. No sound, no twitch, nothing to give her away. Her body tensed, every fiber of her being screaming for action. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement, too quick to be anything else. A shadow, barely visible, flitting between the trees. She acted without thinking. She sprang from her crouch, dashing forward, her sword flashing in the dim light. She had no idea who, or what, she was striking at, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was surviving, escaping the tightening grip of the kingdom's dark power. Her blade sliced through the air with precision, but the figure darted aside faster than she could follow. The moment she missed, they were on her. One of them, swift and silent, closing the gap. Her sword clashed with something. Another blade, quick and sharp, its strength enough to jar her hands. She barely had time to adjust before the figure was upon her, pressing forward with relentless force. She spun, narrowly avoiding the strike, her body already reacting, muscles honed through years of training. The fight was close now, so close she could feel the heat of her opponent's breath on her face. She lashed out again, faster this time. But the figure parried with ease, their movements fluid and practiced. Whoever they were good, very good. Her mind raced, searching for an opening, for an advantage. But every time she thought she had won, the figure closed the gap, moving like a shadow, impossible to pin down. The silence of the forest felt like it had vanished. The sound of metal clashing, the rush of wind as they moved, it all seemed to fill the void, drowning out everything else. She couldn't afford to let this drag on much longer. If she didn't find a way out of this fight soon, there would be no escape. Suddenly, there was a shift, a pause in the rhythm of their movements, just a fraction of a second. She took her chance. Her sword flashed again, this time cutting through the air at an angle that forced the figure back. She pressed the advantage, her feet moving faster than before, her focus sharp. The figure faltered, and in that moment, she made her move. With a quick swipe, she knocked their blade aside and surged forward, pushing them back. For a heartbeat, she saw their face, pale, masked, and almost indistinct in the shadows, before they vanished once again, melting into the forest. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she slowed, her sword still poised, ready to strike. But there was nothing. The figure was gone, disappeared into the dark corners of the forest. She stood there for a moment, her heart racing, her mind still buzzing with adrenaline. The forest was silent again. The hunt had stopped, but she knew it wasn't over. The voice still echoed in her mind, like a shadow on the edge of her thoughts. "We know you're here." It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. They were watching, and they weren't done with her. But she had survived this encounter. She had lived to see another moment. For now, that was enough. Her hands gripped the sword tightly as she scanned the shadows once more, knowing that the storm was far from over. The forest, once a sanctuary of shadows, had turned into a predator's den. She could feel it in her bones now. She wasn't just running from enemies. She was being hunted by something far more insidious. The air had thickened, suffocating her with its weight. Her breath was ragged, her heart still thundering in her chest, but there was no time to stop, no time to think. The voice in her head, "We know you're here," echoed like a pulse in her skull. It wasn't just a threat, it was a certainty. They were everywhere. The moment the figure had vanished into the shadows, her body had frozen. She could still feel their presence, lingering like a ghost in the trees, their eyes watching, waiting for her to make the wrong move. She had escaped, but at what cost? She had shown them she was vulnerable. She had exposed herself. Don't show fear. Don't show weakness. Her mind raced, reminding her of the words that had been drilled into her over the years. She had been trained to survive, trained to fight, but this was different. The game had changed. The rulers behind the kingdom's unrest were far more than just men or mercenaries. They were something older, something that had been lurking in the shadows for far longer than she had ever known. And they weren't going to stop until they had her. She pressed on, moving through the dense forest, each step calculated, each breath measured. The trees seemed to close in around her, their dark silhouettes casting ominous shadows across the path. The village had been just the beginning. She could feel the eyes of the kingdom's unseen rulers upon her, like predators circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her muscles burned, her legs aching from the long hours of running, but she pushed forward. The map had told her to head toward the mountain pass, the place where the traders had gathered. She wasn't sure what she would find there, but she knew it was her only lead. She had to find the answers. She had to stop them before it was too late. She had barely made it through the woods when she heard it again. A voice, low and insistent, threading through her thoughts like a needle. "You can't hide from us." The words weren't just in her mind. They felt real, physical, as if they were spoken by someone standing right behind her. She spun around, her sword already in her hand, ready to strike. But there was nothing. The forest was empty. The shadows were still. For a moment, she stood there, her senses heightened, her body tensed for battle. The voice had been too real, too close. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. She turned back to the path, her eyes scanning the surroundings. It wasn't just the traders she had to worry about anymore. It was the power behind them, the force that had been pulling the strings for centuries, the one that had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating the course of the kingdom's history, the ones who had set this entire game in motion. She could feel their presence, pressing in on her. Every step she took was another step deeper into their domain. But this time, she was prepared. She had made her choice. She wasn't running anymore. The next few miles passed in tense silence. The forest opened up into a rocky terrain as the mountain pass loomed in the distance. She could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on her. It was as if the earth itself was holding her prisoner, trapping her between the past and the future. The darkness of the woods had given way to jagged rocks and towering cliffs. It was beautiful, in a harsh, unforgiving way, but it wasn't the landscape that filled her with dread. It was the knowledge that the deeper she went, the closer she came to the heart of the conspiracy, the closer she came to the ones who had orchestrated everything. And she still didn't know who they were. She had questions. Too many questions. Who were these rulers? What did they want? What did they intend to do with the kingdom? And, most importantly, who could she trust? She kept moving, her sword resting lightly in her hand, her senses alive. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. The path ahead was long, but she could already see the outline of the mountain pass. The air had grown colder, sharper, the kind of cold that gnawed at your bones. The village had felt like a trap. This place felt like an ambush. She reached the foot of the mountain pass, her eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs, looking for any sign of movement. The sky above was thick with clouds, and the wind howled through the cracks in the stone. She could hear the sound of rushing water somewhere far off, but there were no voices, no signs of life. Just the eerie silence of the mountains. She stepped forward cautiously, each footfall echoing in the stillness. And that's when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of movement, something shifting in the shadows behind her. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her sword raised high. But there was no one. The cliffside was empty. The shadows stretched long and dark, but they revealed nothing. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was closing in on her. She didn't wait. She couldn't afford to wait. She dashed forward, keeping to the edge of the cliffs, her eyes darting around for any sign of danger. The voice had been in her mind, but now she could feel it. The cold touch of eyes watching her from the rocks, from the trees. She was being followed, and she wasn't sure who or what they were. Were they the rulers she had heard about, the ones who controlled everything? Or was it something worse? The mountain pass grew narrower, the rocks pressing in around her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached the first of the stone gates, a massive archway of rock that seemed to swallow her whole as she passed through. Beyond it, the path continued, winding deeper into the mountain. She had no choice. She had to press forward. She had come too far to stop now. Her pulse quickened as the wind howled louder, but it was not the wind she feared. It was the unknown. It was the power she couldn't see, the enemies she couldn't identify, and it was closing in on her. The wind howled louder as she moved deeper into the mountain pass, the narrow path winding between jagged cliffs and sharp rocks. The cold bit at her skin, but it wasn't the chill of the night that made her shiver. It was the feeling that had been growing ever since she stepped foot in this place. An overwhelming sense that she was being drawn towards something darker, something ancient. She couldn't escape the feeling that every step she took was leading her to a point of no return. The air felt thick here, dense with a heavy silence that pressed in from all sides. She could feel the weight of it, like the very stones were watching her, listening for her every movement. The shadows cast by the cliffs seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if they were alive, following her every step. Every instinct she had screamed at her to turn back, to retreat to the familiar safety of the forest, but she couldn't. There was no turning back now. She had come too far. Her fingers gripped the hilt of her sword tightly, but it was more than just the sword that kept her steady. It was the resolve that had been building inside her, the burning determination to uncover the truth, to confront the powers that had been manipulating the kingdom, pulling the strings from the shadows. She had chosen this path, and there was no going back. Ahead of her, the mountain pass narrowed even further, the walls of rock towering high on either side. It was a natural choke point, a place where anyone trying to move through would be exposed, vulnerable. She knew that the people, whatever they were, who had been watching her would make their move soon. She could feel their presence growing stronger with every step. The path ahead turned sharply, and as she rounded the corner, she saw it. A massive stone structure, carved into the mountainside itself. It was a fortress, an ancient one, long abandoned by the kingdom's history but now repurposed for something darker. The entrance was marked by two towering stone pillars, each one engraved with intricate symbols that sent a chill down her spine. The symbols were familiar, but their meaning eluded her. They were the same ones she had seen on the map, on the small box back in the village. The same ones that had haunted her thoughts. The fortress, the heart of the conspiracy, the place where the rulers, the ones behind the chaos in the kingdom, had been hiding. Her mind raced as she approached the entrance, her hand instinctively reaching for the hidden blade she had kept beneath her cloak. She had no idea who or what was inside, but she couldn't afford to be caught off guard. She stepped forward cautiously, her boots silent on the rough stone, but her heart pounding as she neared the massive entrance. The air around her seemed to shift. The wind howled again, but now, it carried with it a strange, almost inaudible whisper. It wasn't the wind at all, it was something else. A voice. The same one that had warned her in the village, the one that had spoken in her mind, cold and detached. She could almost hear the words again, like a chill breath on her neck. You should never have come. She froze. The voice wasn't in her head this time. It was real. It was coming from somewhere inside the fortress. She had no choice but to move forward. They were waiting for her. The rulers, the traitors, the power that had orchestrated the kingdom's fall. They were all here. Her fingers tightened around the sword hilt, and with one final deep breath, she stepped inside the entrance. The interior of the fortress was nothing like the cold, barren mountain path she had just traversed. Inside, the stone walls were lined with ancient tapestries, faded with age but still impressive in their scale. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something darker, something she couldn't quite place. It was a place of power, of long-held secrets. She could feel it in her bones. But as she moved deeper into the hall, the eerie silence wrapped itself around her. There were no guards, no sounds of movement. She expected to be greeted by something, by a voice, by a presence. But instead, the fortress remained still, as though it were waiting for her to make the first move. And then she saw it, a faint light flickering at the end of the hall, just beyond the shadows. Her breath caught as she moved toward it, cautiously, every step echoing in the silence. As she reached the end of the hall, she stopped, her eyes falling on a figure standing before an altar. The figure was cloaked in dark robes, their face hidden beneath a hood, but there was something unmistakable in their presence. They radiated power, as if the very air around them had been infused with a force far older than anything she had ever known. The figure spoke, their voice low and rich with authority. "You've finally come. We've been waiting for you." The words sent a shiver through her spine. She wasn't sure who this person was, but she knew they were part of the force she had been chasing, part of the power behind the traitors, the rulers who had shaped the kingdom's destiny from the shadows. "You knew I would come," she said, her voice steady, but her hands still gripped the sword tightly. The figure nodded slowly. "Of course we knew. You've always been a part of our plan. Every step you've taken, every decision you've made, has been in service to us. You can't escape what you are. You never could." Her heart skipped a beat, her grip on the sword tightening. "I came here to stop you," she said through clenched teeth. "I came here to stop everything you've set in motion." The figure tilted their head slightly, as if considering her words. "You think you can stop us? The world is already changing. The pieces have been set into motion for centuries. And you're simply the catalyst for what was always meant to be." The words hit her like a slap. Everything she had fought for, everything she had believed, was crumbling. She had thought she could fight against the rulers, fight against the forces that had destroyed the kingdom. But now, as she stood before the cloaked figure, she realized the truth. She had never been in control. They had been playing her all along. The figure stepped forward, their presence overwhelming, and in that moment, she understood. They weren't just trying to control the kingdom. They had been controlling her, shaping her every move. And now it was too late. The air in the chamber grew thicker, the weight of the figure's words hanging over her like a crushing storm. She stood frozen, the sword still in her hand, but her grip had loosened. It wasn't fear. No, it wasn't fear that gripped her now. It was the realization that everything she had fought for, everything she had believed in, had been nothing more than a piece on a much larger board. The figure before her, this puppet master who had been pulling the strings all along, was a part of the power that had corrupted everything. She had thought she was uncovering secrets, finding the truth. But now, standing here, it seemed as if she had been led in circles, brought to this point by design. "You've been watching me all along," she said, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from the bitter taste of betrayal that now filled her mouth. The figure didn't reply at first. They took a slow, deliberate step toward her, their cloak billowing like some dark storm. The shadows around them seemed to bend and shift, moving in tandem with their every step. She could feel the weight of their gaze, even though their face was hidden beneath a hood. It didn't matter. She knew they were watching her, knew that they saw everything. "You were always part of the plan," the figure said finally, their voice like velvet, smooth and almost soothing. "You were always meant to play your part. The pieces were set long before you ever set foot in that tavern. You've been led here as intended." Her mind raced. The path she had followed, the path that had begun in that quiet tavern with the outlaws and the stranger, had been manipulated from the very beginning. Every choice she had made, every step she had taken, had been a calculated move by the very forces she had thought she was fighting against. Her heart raced, the pulse of betrayal growing louder in her chest. "You've been using me," she whispered, barely able to believe the words as they left her lips. "All of this, everything I've done, it was all a part of your plan." The figure's voice grew colder. It wasn't just a plan. It was destiny. Their tone was final, as if they were speaking a truth she could no longer deny. "You were never meant to win. You were meant to reveal the truth, to draw out the others who still hold on to the illusion of freedom. And when that happens, we will claim what is ours. What has always been ours." Her mind spun. The weight of their words pressed down on her, threatening to crush everything she had believed in. She had thought herself a player in this game, but she was nothing more than a pawn, moved across a board by unseen hands. And now, they were telling her that the end was inevitable, that it was already written. She could feel the cold dread crawling through her veins, the suffocating certainty of their power. "No," she said, shaking her head as if to clear the fog. "This isn't how it ends. I won't let you do this." The figure raised their hand slowly, and she felt it, a surge of power, of raw energy that seemed to pulse from them, bending the very air around her. Her knees buckled slightly as the force of their presence pressed against her. She couldn't move, couldn't think, the force of their will tightening around her. "You don't have the power to stop this," they said softly, almost regretfully, as if trying to explain the unexplainable. "You were never meant to stop it. You were meant to show the world that the kingdom is already lost. To show them that their rebellion is nothing more than a fleeting fantasy." Her chest constricted, and for a moment, the world seemed to spin around her, disorienting and cold. The weight of their words hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. How could she fight something like this? How could she win against an enemy who had already known every step she would take, every move she would make? "You've been chasing ghosts," the figure said. "You've been trying to stop something that is already inevitable. The rulers of this kingdom have always controlled it, from the shadows, from the moment it was founded. And you, girl, were always part of that legacy." The truth cut through her like a blade. She had never truly known freedom, never known a life where she wasn't being shaped by forces beyond her understanding. She had fought so hard to find herself, to carve a path in a world that had never given her a chance. And now, she understood. It wasn't just the traitors. It wasn't just the conspirators. It was something older, more powerful, and it had been here all along. She could feel the rage rising within her. Hot, fiery, an ember that had been smoldering for years. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be part of their plan. And yet, they had made her a part of it. But there was still a part of her that refused to let this be the end. No matter what they said, no matter how inevitable it seemed, she couldn't give up. She couldn't let the kingdom fall into their hands. Not without a fight. She stepped forward, despite the pressure in the air, despite the overwhelming force of their will that threatened to crush her. "You may have controlled everything so far," she said, her voice low but filled with determination. "But you've underestimated one thing." The figure tilted their head, as if intrigued, but they said nothing. She took a deep breath, her sword now gripped firmly in her hand. "You've underestimated me." In a flash, she lunged. The sword cut through the air, her body moving with a speed born of desperation and raw determination. She didn't know if it would work, if she would even be able to touch them, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't just surrender. The figure's eyes flashed, and with a single, swift motion, they raised their hand. The sword met an invisible barrier, the blade shuddering as if it had hit solid stone. A shockwave of power erupted from them, sending her flying backward, crashing against the stone walls of the fortress with a force that left her gasping for breath. She lay there for a moment, dazed, her body aching. She had fought, she had pushed, but the figure had been too powerful. The kingdom's rulers were too strong, their control too complete. But even as the darkness began to close in on her, a single thought burned in her mind. "I won't stop fighting. I can't stop fighting." The world spun in a haze as she struggled to push herself up from the stone floor. Her body ached with the force of the blow, her head throbbing from the collision with the cold, unforgiving stone. For a moment, she lay there, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from the realization of what she had just faced. She had failed. In that moment, it had felt like everything had come crashing down. Every step she had taken, every decision she had made, had led her to this point, and still, it hadn't been enough. But even as the weight of defeat pressed down on her chest, there was something else, something stronger, a flicker of defiance, an ember of resistance that refused to die. She couldn't let it end here. Her fingers, still trembling from the shock, tightened around the hilt of her sword. She could feel its weight, the familiar comfort of it. The sword was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol, a reminder of everything she had fought for, everything she had lost, and everything she still had to gain. The figures stood before her, their presence like an immovable force, cold and unyielding. Their eyes gleamed beneath the hood, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You fought well," the figure said, their voice as smooth and detached as ever. But there was a trace of something, perhaps regret, perhaps pity. "But you cannot win. You never could." She struggled to her feet, gritting her teeth against the pain, her sword still in her grasp. "I won't stop," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with the strength of her resolve. "I've come too far to give up now." The figure stepped forward, their gaze unwavering. "You're nothing more than a puppet, a tool. You were never meant to be anything more. You were created to serve a purpose." The words stung, but they also sparked something inside her. Anger, resilience. She was not just a pawn. She had never been just a pawn. "You're wrong," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I'm not a puppet. I've made my own choices. I've fought for my own freedom. And I'll keep fighting, no matter what you say." The figure's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile without warmth. "You think you can stop us? You think you can stop the fate of the kingdom? The wheels have already been set in motion. There is nothing you can do to change it." She stood tall now, her sword held high, her body still aching, but her spirit burning brighter than ever. "Maybe I can't change everything, but I can make a difference. I can fight, and that's enough." With a roar, she lunged again, her sword cutting through the air toward the figure. But this time, she didn't hesitate. This time, there was no fear, no doubt in her heart. She wasn't fighting to win. She was fighting to survive. The figure raised their hand, and a dark force surged from them, slamming into her like a wall, sending her sprawling across the stone floor once more. But even as she hit the ground, she didn't stop. She didn't stay down. She stood again, faster this time, pushing through the pain, refusing to yield. She would not fall. Not here. Not now. The figure's patience was wearing thin. Their hand moved again, summoning the dark energy that had already once thrown her back. But this time, she anticipated it. She sidestepped, using her agility to avoid the blast of energy that would have sent her flying. Her sword slashed through the air with deadly precision, aiming straight for the figure's chest. But just as the blade was about to strike, the figure's eyes flared with a powerful energy. With a gesture of their hand, the blade was stopped mid-swing, held in place by an invisible force. The energy surged through her, and for a moment, she felt her strength draining, as if the life was being sucked from her very bones. But then, something inside her broke free. A surge of defiance, a scream from deep within her that refused to be silenced. She pushed harder, forcing the sword forward, using every ounce of willpower to break through the force that held her. And then, finally, her blade cut through, slicing through the air with a force that shattered the barrier. The figure recoiled, their face finally revealed beneath the hood. It was a face she didn't recognize, pale, cold, with an expression that was almost human. But there was no warmth there, no compassion, just the cold certainty of someone who had already won. "You still don't understand," the figure whispered, their voice a low, almost disappointed murmur. "You can't defeat us." Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling, but her sword still held high. "I may not defeat you," she said, her voice filled with defiance, "but I'll never stop fighting." With one final swing, she pressed the sword forward. The figure raised a hand to block it, but this time, There was no unseen force. There was no power to stop her. This time, she struck true. The sword pierced through the figure's chest, and for the briefest of moments, she saw their eyes, wide with shock, filled with something that might have been fear, or perhaps regret. But it was too late. The darkness that had once seemed so insurmountable began to crumble. The figures staggered back, the light in their eyes fading as their form began to dissipate, their power unraveling like a thread. And as the darkness around her began to recede, she stood alone, the remnants of the fortress around her falling into ruin. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. As the dust settled, the young woman lowered her sword, exhaustion flooding her body. She had fought, and she had won. But she knew this was only the beginning. The kingdom was still in turmoil. There was still much to do. And the rulers, though defeated in this moment, were not gone. Not yet. She had made her choice. She had taken a stand. And now, she would see it through to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.